Hello! Today I'd like to introduce a fun theme that you'll see in several of my upcoming videos. I don't know if it has a real name, but I call it experimental quilting. One of the most exciting things about quilting is what we can do with all the wonderful machines, tools, and techniques of this day and age, coupled with the magnificent fabrics and high-quality threads we have to work with. Also, while I almost never use someone else's quilt patterns, I've learned a lot of techniques from other artists, so I can try new things. And I've had to invent a few techniques myself when I couldn't find another way to do something. So for me, experimental quilting is about testing and combining all of these to make quilts I might not have been able to otherwise. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but it's always fun. Sometimes I try using things I learned from other arts in my quilting. For example, I designed a few quilts based on ikebana, or Japanese flower arranging. I learned quite a lot about ikebana in Japan in the 1960s. Almost enough to become a master, like getting a black belt in karate. When I started quilting, I was surprised how much I could use some of the same concepts. Here's one that I made for Hoffman Challenge. It was one of the first quilts I entered into a competition. Anyway, at some point, I'm hoping to do a video or two on ikebana for quilters, where we work through a quilt project using these design principles. I started another set of experimental quilts because some of my family enjoy stargazing and amateur astronomy, sometimes even taking pictures of the night sky with a telescope and a camera. This gave me the idea of making quilts like this. I use NASA photos that are available for public use as my inspiration for them. At first I had a hard time coming up with a good way to get the right look for nebulas and galaxies. Thread work didn't seem to look right, and piecing and applique wouldn't either. You need something shimmery and almost translucent. What I finally came up with was using Angelina fibers and appliquing them down with a layer of very fine black veiling. This Fire Galaxy quilt is a good example. The veiling disappears so much it is really hard to see, even when you come up close to the quilt. So you just see the colors layered on your background. Then you can quilt it like you would any other quilt. This is the first quilt I made this way. It's Stellar Nursery. There's a really famous picture in NASA called Mountains of Creation that made me think of doing this. I tried to capture it as closely as I could. Some of my favorite quilts that I have made for competitions were inspired by illuminated ancient manuscripts, like this one. There's something about the combination of intricate art and calligraphy that makes a great aesthetic for quilts. So far, I have made 3, but they're small and they take a lot of time to create. Getting the right look for them has been tricky, and I'm always testing new things to improve what I can do. First, I experimented with the base fabric. Most of my other competition quilts are based on cotton, but for these, I found the best looks on a silk, or a silk blend satin weave. Polyester satins and dupiones also make a nice alternative, though I will use silks if I can find the right ones. Once I'm done with the quilting, I finish it off with a touch of fabric paint to highlight some details. The silk is important for this because it takes it well. Here, for example, I used gold paint to fill in the stitched Celtic borders of Pendragon, my Arthurian quilt. I also had to figure out how to approach the pictorial elements. On Pendragon, I used some digitally printed fabrics for hands and faces, and for some of the background to get the right perspective. I appliqued a selection of fabrics for clothes and other elements, and I created tiny quilts for the banners. Details like chainmail and hair are thread work, and to get the symbols right, I made custom embroidery patterns. Not all of my experiments have been a big success. I found that one of the toughest parts of these experiments has been learning to look at the results as objective an eye as possible to really see where I can improve things. It often takes some time before I can really evaluate them since I'm too close to it at first. But it's always better when I see things for myself than later in judges' comments. Sometimes it takes making a whole quilt with a new technique to see how something is going to work. For this one, I had the idea to create line drawing with different thread weights and a lot of precision quilting. It's inspired by a drawing by Jan de Vries, a 16th century architect. It got into shows, but it didn't place. And I think the problem with it was the colors. I tried to capture the look of the pen and the ink drawing on paper, but they gave it too much of a lackluster appearance without enough contrast to show off the stitching. That's something I'll have to think about for the future. Since then, I've also started making some small test quilts like these to experiment with various techniques. With this butterfly quilt, I got to test both using digitally printed fabric and some special threadwork techniques for three-dimensional looks. I didn't make it for competition, but it was a fun project. I will probably do a video on this in the future. A lot of my experiments have involved trying to make better landscape quilts with great mountains, running rivers, gorgeous skies, and trees all around. I've tried everything from hand-dyed fabric to thread art to who knows what. Here is one of my first landscapes. It has some design flaws, but I learned a great deal making this quilt, and I particularly love the mountains. I like to think I've improved a lot since I made it. I'm setting up a series of videos on landscape elements, starting with trees. So I won't go into those too much today, but I did want to show you my latest landscape quilt, Night on the Bayou. It was based on a piece of art by Disney artist Joel Christopher Payne, who graciously allowed me to use his art for a fee. My family calls it my Scooby-Doo quilt, and I guess it does have that look to it. It was a true adventure to make. For years, I had been collecting various wood-themed fabrics, and I used them throughout this. I fussy-cut planks of wood from different fabrics and used them to assemble the house and the houseboat. I used all the different tree bark fabrics I had for the big cypress trees, and then couched yarn on their limbs as realistically as I could after studying a lot of cypress tree pictures. Then I free motion stitched the Spanish moss hanging around with 12-weight wool blend thread. I also couched some of the bushes and weeds growing around in the water. The lights inside the houseboat and the fireflies were painted in with special paint, so black lights would reveal the night scene with fireflies and lights in the window and reflections on the water. By the way, I'd like to say thanks to my daughter-in-law for letting me use her studio for this video. She has a huge design wall here that is great for photographing quilts. So what is next? I don't know, but I'm sure I'm not done with experimental quilting. If there's any questions you have, put them in the comments and I'll see if I can answer them. See you next time, and above all, have fun in your studio. As you see, it has a little more cut along the edges of the applique, but it also has a black veil on it.
Nobody can see that because that's not on camera.
Oh.